This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 175 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was a weird one for this matchup show, and I say that because the processes seemed to be right for some guys while the results weren't, but then the opposite was kind of true too. Like I mentioned, Derek Carr is a decent streaming play last week, and he would have been totally fine had he not thrown an interception on the 1 yard line. Dante Moncrief was a deep play at wide receiver, and the process was right. He saw 15 targets, but the result could have been better because he had 6 catches for 76 yards. Nyheim Hines saw a big workload, but posted an average performance. The fact that he saw a lot of touches is good. We want touches and volume in fantasy football. The result of those touches weren't as good as they could have been, though. And I didn't really like Russell Wilson last week, and he became the first player this season to throw for fewer than 200 yards while tossing 3 touchdowns. So again, I don't think the process was wrong at all with that Russell Wilson call, but the results did not look pretty. But then there was Matt Breida. I thought that Matt Breida was more of a low-end RB2, but he got injured. He was on his way to a pretty strong day. I would have gotten that assessment wrong had he not gotten hurt, but it doesn't look so bad because he did get hurt. Overall, it wasn't a bad week, it was just a weird one, like I said. Before we get into this week's players, I wanted to let all of you know that FanDuel is teaming up with Dash Digital Cash, the fastest digital payment system on the planet, to bring the community a new type of prize and exciting new contests every month. Dash, the evolution of money. Check out the Crypto Cup on FanDuel.com for more info. When looking at quarterback rankings this week, it was honestly tough to find disagreements. I think things are fairly straightforward. So I decided that I'd talk through some guys that listeners seem to be questioning this week in order to help. The first one is Jameis Winston. I think he's pretty firmly a QB1 this week against the Falcons. Atlanta's been awful against the pass this year given their injuries across the defense, and they've surrendered a top 10 fantasy performance to each quarterback that they faced, not named Nick Foles. Now, to be fair, they've gone up against Cam Newton, Drew Brees, Andy Dalton, and Ben Roethlisberger, but that's pretty insane consistency in a year where there's a lot of competition at the quarterback position. The fear with Winston, as a lot of you guys pointed out to me on Twitter, is that he's yet to see a lot of game action this year. He's only played in a blowout against the Bears. I think that's maybe a slight concern, but you have to think that Tampa Bay wouldn't throw him under center unless he's ready. He's playing in a domed environment with one of the highest over-unders on the slate. Jameis Winston is a strong play. A lot of you guys also asked about Andy Dalton. I think Andy Dalton's in the low-end QB1 range this week against Pittsburgh. The apprehension with Dalton is that he's playing a common opponent and it's in the division. And that's something that hasn't worked out in his favor in the past. Dalton's averaging a little over 13 fantasy points per game against the Steelers over his last 5 completed regular season games against them. But this Steelers defense has only come through once this year, and it was last week against the Falcons at home. They've looked pretty dreadful otherwise. They've also allowed the second most air yards in football this season, and they've allowed the 4th most 15-plus air yard plays as well. This game has a high over-under and could see a lot of scoring. And if that's the case, Andy Dalton's going to be involved. Like I said, I like him as a lower-end QB1 this week. I'd play him over Russell Wilson, who has just as good of a matchup, but has some touchdown regression coming. And as you'll hear later, I think Seattle may find success on the ground this week too. Now, on the flip side, one quarterback I'm kind of scared to use this week is Phillip Rivers. It's not because he'll completely destroy your fantasy football roster, don't get me wrong, but the Browns have been good this year defensively. They actually own NumberFire's top-ranked secondary thanks to all of their takeaways, and only Derek Carr has been able to finish a week as a QB1 against them this year, and he had overtime to help him. And that's while facing Ben Roethlisberger and Drew Brees. And while Rivers has been great this year, he also hasn't faced the toughest competition in the world. He's had games against the Chiefs, 49ers, and Raiders. And then he also faced the Rams in a game where they lost Aqib Talib and Marcus Peters. The Chargers also had the dreaded early game in the Eastern time zone after traveling from out west. Not that that's overly significant, but it's just another reason to be a tad lower on Phillip Rivers this week. If you're hoping for a Mitch Trubisky encore, I don't think it's happening this week. He's surprisingly ranked ahead of players like Joe Flacco, Eli Manning, and even the deeper play that I'm going to talk about this week in a second, but I don't like the matchup for Mitch Trubisky. Miami ranks dead last in situation neutral pace, and they're last in overall pace as well. And meanwhile, Chicago ranks 30th in overall pace and 23rd in situation neutral pace. So it could be a slower game, and that may limit overall scoring opportunities. And all the while, Miami's actually been pretty decent against the pass this year. No quarterback has finished ranked higher than QB 16 in weekly scoring against them. And they've faced Derek Carr, Tom Brady, and Andy Dalton. This isn't the same type of matchup like we saw against the Buccaneers a couple of weeks ago for Mitch Trubisky. The deep play of the week who I'd actually play over Trubisky is Case Keenum. The Rams are 7-point favorites against the Broncos in Denver this weekend, and Keenum has not been good this year. But LA's now given up 3 passing touchdowns in each of their last 2 games, and those are 2 games without Aqib Talib. And I think we've got to look at the fact that maybe the defense isn't as good as we thought coming into the season. They looked amazing to start the year, but they also faced Derek Carr and Sam Bradford. I mean, it's a good unit with some unbelievable pieces, but it's not a matchup that you need to completely avoid. The probable negative game script for the Broncos at home here doesn't bother me as much as it would if he were on the road as well. I mean, look, Keenum's not an easy quarterback to plug into your lineup. He's got tremendous downside. He may not even have his job in a couple of weeks. But if you need to dig pretty deep, I don't completely mind him. And trust me, a lot of that has to do with his weapons and not Keenum himself. Over Chris Carson's last 2 games, he's combined to carry the ball 51 times for a 72% rushing share in that Seattle offense. Now, for some context, only 3 players in the NFL have a 72% rushing share this season. Now, he's only seen 3 targets across those 2 games, but you're playing him this week as an RB2 because of the rushing. The Seahawks are facing the Raiders, who have been 5th worst against the run on a per-rush basis, according to NumberFire's expected points model. One thing in particular that I find interesting in this matchup is that Carson has been really good at running between his guards this year. Of all the backs with 20-plus carries up the middle, he ranks 3rd in yards per carry. And Oakland has been atrocious at stopping runs up the gut. So I like Chris Carson a good bit this week. This is one matchup where Seattle's run-heavy tendencies should actually work out pretty well. I mentioned Jordan Howard a couple of weeks ago on my 15 Transactions podcast as a buy, and I think we see a turnaround game for him this week. It was very clear in Chicago's Week 4 game against Tampa Bay that they had a pass-first game plan. Even after leading big at the half, they came out throwing in the second half. The good news is that Howard still did outsnap Tariq Cohen in that game, and we know Howard's going to be the team's goal line back. Miami's been really bad against opposing running backs this year too. Week 1, Dion Lewis was an RB10. Week 2, Bilal Powell was an RB10. Week 3, Marshawn Lynch was the RB11. Week 4, we saw both James White and Sony Michel post usable performances. And then last week, Joe Mixon was the RB11. Every week, a running back against Miami has been relevant in fantasy football. Given Miami's secondary is much better than Tampa Bay's, it would make sense for Chicago to not have the same type of approach as they did 2 weeks ago. And that means more Jordan Howard. I can't quit Aaron Jones. This really isn't me being stubborn and just wanting Aaron Jones to be something in fantasy football. I fully recognize that coaching decisions will drive volume for running backs, and volume is what a back needs in fantasy football to be worthwhile. And Mike McCarthy has opted to use Jamal Williams and Ty Montgomery quite a bit. But here's the thing. Aaron Jones has been back for 3 games now. In Game 1, he played 25% of Green Bay's snaps. In Game 2, that jumped up to 38%. Both of those contests were positive game scripts. Then last week happened. Last week, Aaron Jones was 3rd in running back snaps in that backfield. Much of that had to do with an ultra-negative game script where McCarthy used the pass-catching Montgomery and the guy who has the best pass-blocking chops, which is Jamal Williams. So now we're in Week 6 where Green Bay is a heavy favorite against the 49ers. If they can get out to an early lead, I'd expect us to see more Aaron Jones than we have this season. And that's what makes him a lower-end RB2 this week in an environment where there aren't many running backs locked into strong workloads. I saw that LeSean McCoy was ranked as an RB2 this week, and I still don't know how you can confidently place him there. Houston ranks in the middle of the pack in fantasy points allowed to running backs this year, but they've also faced the Patriots, Saquon Barkley, and Ezekiel Elliott. They've allowed 2 RB1 performances on the season, with one of those coming against Barkley, which is understandable, and the other against Nyheim Hines. It took Nyheim Hines 11 targets and 2 touchdowns to get there. Houston, according to NumberFire's schedule-adjusted expected points model, actually has the league's best rush defense. So if you're playing McCoy this week, it's because you think he can do a lot through the air. That's certainly possible, but Buffalo's also been one of the most run-heavy teams in football this year. And they've been the most run-heavy team in neutral game scripts. They've thrown the ball just 141 times, so even if Shady has a high target share, it's a high share of a smaller pie. The Bills want to run the football, but they might not be able to against Houston. I think better days are coming for McCoy, but to me, he's more of an RB3 this week. Isaiah Crowell went nuts last week, carrying the ball 15 times for 219 yards. but I'm less high on him than what the consensus thinks here in week 6. The matchup certainly isn't that bad, with the Jets being at home as 2.5-point favorites against an Indy defense that's been average against the run to start the year. But it's important to keep in mind that Crowell was on the field for just 40.3% of New York snaps in last weekend's blow-up game. He's still seen only 8 targets this year, and his 42% rushing share isn't anything to get excited about. I still worry that if a game gets away from New York, Crowell won't be on the field all that much. He's only seen 8 targets this year for a sub 6% target share, while Bilal Powell has double the amount of looks through the air. So overall, I think Crowell is more of an RB3 or a flex play given his game script downside. It's not that I think the Jets can't win this game. They absolutely can win this game. It's just that where he's being ranked, it's as if the Jets are absolutely going to win this game. My deep play of the week is Kyle Juszczyk. Juszczyk now has an 11% target share in the season, and that's been with healthy running backs around him. It doesn't sound great for Matt Breida here in week 6, which means the 49ers are lacking a real pass-catching threat out of the backfield because Alfred Morris is their lead back. And as 9.5-point underdogs, they could be throwing a lot in this game. And with CJ Beathard under center, they could be throwing a lot to their backfield. I noted on this podcast a couple of weeks ago when Jimmy Garoppolo tore his ACL that CJ Beathard really liked targeting his backs through the air when he played last year. Carlos Hyde dominated with over 8 targets per game with CJ Beathard, and that fell to fewer than 4 without him. Beathard was targeting his running backs on over 36% of his passes in 2017. In 2018, CJ Beathard has thrown 91 passes, and over 25% of those tosses have gone to players in his backfield. That's not as high as his rate last year, but that's still a decent rate. Juszczyk saw 7 targets last week, and I think he could be decently involved in the passing attack this week as long as Matt Breida is out. So if you're in a PPR league, he's not a bad play. I was surprised to see Sammy Watkins ranked as a wide receiver 3 this week, and a lower end one at that. He was knocked out with a hamstring injury in the first half of their game against Denver 2 weeks ago, but even without playing roughly 3/4 of a game this year, he still has a 16.5% target share in the Chiefs' offense. And the Chiefs are in a matchup that projects to be a high-scoring one against the Patriots this week. New England's allowed the 3rd most air yards in the league, and Patrick Mahomes has the highest average depth of target in football. That's going to help guys like Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill more than Sammy Watkins, but it's also going to help the team be more effective offensively. Watkins is currently ranked behind Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, and Sterling Shepard on Fantasy Pros. I would play Watkins over all 3 of them. To me, he's a wide receiver 2 this week. There seems to be a pretty big gap between how people are viewing Deshaun Jackson and Chris Godwin this week. And while I can understand someone wanting to play Deshaun Jackson over Godwin, I don't think they deserve wide receiver 2 status versus wide receiver 4 status. We know the matchup is good. I already talked about the matchup with Jameis Winston. And Atlanta has also allowed a bottom 10 success rate to opposing wide receivers this year. But Jackson hasn't been utilized in the red zone this season when Chris Godwin has. Godwin has 6 red zone targets, with all of those coming from within the 10-yard line. And 3 of those have come at the goal line. Deshaun Jackson just has 1 red zone target. I like both wideouts in a high-scoring game, but don't sleep on Chris Godwin. He should play a decent number of snaps, and he should be involved. Corey Davis continues to have all of the peripherals. He has the 3rd highest target share in football, he's been utilized well in the red zone, and he's seen almost 44% of the team's air yards. The problem is, his team hasn't been very good. They're averaging just 27 yards per drive, which is one of the worst marks in the league, and only 6 teams have a worse net yards per attempt rate. This week, Tennessee is facing Baltimore in Baltimore. The Ravens have number 5's 2nd-ranked defense, and they're allowing the lowest success rate to opposing wide receivers this year. So even with the strong market share numbers, Corey Davis isn't a locked-in starter this week. I also noticed that Larry Fitzgerald is still being ranked as a wide receiver 4, and I just don't think that you can do it. You can't play him right now. He hasn't seen more than 5 targets in a game since week 1, and the Cardinals continue to run the fewest plays in football week in and week out. So I wouldn't be playing Fitz once again. I'd most definitely be using someone like Chris Godwin over Larry Fitzgerald in week 6. My deep play of the week is a risky one, but that's why it's deep, and it's Antonio Callaway. Callaway still played over 68% of Cleveland's snaps last week, even though it sounded like the team was going to not utilize him quite as much leading up to their game against Baltimore. But Rashard Higgins is out now, leaving Callaway with more opportunity. And the matchup against the Chargers is interesting. It's not exactly awesome all around, but LA's allowed the 3rd most passing plays on throws that traveled 15 or more air yards this year. Meanwhile, Callaway has 10 deep ball targets this season, representing over 34% of his overall targets. He's super risky, but he's a big play waiting to happen, and this is a defense that you can make it happen against. Like every week with tight end and defense, I'm just going to talk through some guys who are deeper plays. If your tight end is seeing volume, he's worthwhile as a start. The first guy I like this week is CJ Uzomah. Tyler Kroft is now on a walking boot, so Uzomah is going to be the primary tight end in that Cincinnati offense. That's good news against a Pittsburgh defense that's allowed the most receptions and the second most yards to the tight end position this season. And if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you could look Niles Paul's way. Austin Seferian-Jenkins is now on injured reserve, which means Niles Paul is Jacksonville's top pass-catching tight end. Last week against Kansas City, he caught 7 passes for 65 yards, and he ended up running 33 routes, which was a top 10 number at the position. This week, he's going to get a Dallas defense that's allowed the 4th most receptions to the tight end position this year. It's really a dart throw, but so are most waiver wire tight ends. 2 defenses that I like this week are Green Bay and Dallas. Green Bay might not be on your waiver wire, but Dallas should be. With the Packers, it's pretty simple. They're big favorites playing at home against an offense that's led by a backup quarterback. Over the last 2 weeks, the Chargers and Cardinals have gotten 16 quarterback hits on CJ Beathard, and they've picked him off 4 times. In what should be a positive script for the Packers, they make a good, obvious play. Dallas is a little bit tougher to use, but they're not in an awful spot. The game will be played in Dallas, which is a plus, and there's a low over-under, which means they should have a reasonable floor. But they're going up against Blake Bortles, who's been pretty bad of late. In each of the Jags' last 3 games, defenses have ranked in the top 10 in fantasy scoring in that given week in each game. You could do a lot worse than the Cowboys' defense this week. That's going to be it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter, too, @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the mailbag episode.